But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press.
Police abuse is an intensely patterned phenomena.
16 times! 16 times! 16 times!
If an officer starts to enjoy roughing people up, nothing happens, there's no intervention, there's no rigorous investigation, there's reason to fear that the next police shooting will involve an officer who's been on that path.
16 shots at the cover-up! 16 shots at the cover-up!
Every data point in the Citizens Police Data Project is a story of abuse. What we found is it was almost an infinitesimal percentage that resulted in any kind of meaningful discipline.
The right decision and locking Jason Van Dyke up and let it be a message to every Chicago.
We had had a system in this police department that really was, in a sense, dedicated to not knowing things that were knowable. Tremendous harms for societies flow from that kind of official denial. The antidote is transparency, and it's really that core principle that the Invisible Institute is dedicated to. This is a hyper-segregated city, and I began to try to understand the larger city in which I lived, and eventually found myself in this utterly fascinating and compelling world of high-rise public housing. That setting was where I was exposed to certain patterns of unconstitutional, abusive, predatory policing. So my reporting came to focus very intensely on those conditions on the ground. And after several years of that kind of reporting, several of the cases gave rise to federal civil rights lawsuits, one of which became a now landmark decision, Calvin versus Chicago, in which I was the plaintiff. And finally, in 2014, the ruling in the case of the Illinois Appellate Court was that police misconduct files are public information. They belong to the public. What we learned was from 2000 to 2016, only 1.2% of civilian complaints resulted in an officer being disciplined in the form of suspension or termination. Out of more than 8,700 excessive force claims from January 2007 to June 2016, investigators sustained only 1.5% of the cases. Some 61% of complaints come from Black Chicagoans, yet those complaints make up only 25% of those eventually proven. Similarly, Black officers are disproportionately found guilty of an offense and suffer higher punishments as a result. We had this incredible trove of information, and so the question for us became, how do we go about making this information legible, useful to citizens in general? The outgrowth of that is something called the Citizens Police Data Project, a public-facing database that houses in civil society these documents and allows all sorts of lines of inquiry and analysis. I mean, fully 82% of the force received between 0 and 4 complaints in the course of their careers. Some officers and some groups of officers have extraordinarily high numbers of complaints. Now, nobody would for a moment suggest that pattern predicted what happened on October 20th, 2014.
The police are gay!
The Laquan McDonald case is really probably the single most dramatic illustration of why it's so important that public information be public.
3 Chicago police officers are charged with an alleged cover-up in connection with the deadly shooting of a Black teenager.
The initial official account of the shooting was aggressive young man with a knife lunges at police officer in self-defense and defense of his fellow officers. The police officer shoots him in the chest. He dies sometime later at a nearby hospital. A copy of the autopsy revealed that he was shot 16 times, front and back. So whatever happened that night the police account of what happened could not be true. And I published an article February 10th, 2015 in Slate reporting on this, which is what sort of broke the story open. For the next 13 months beyond the incident, the city continued to double down on its false narrative. Refused to release the video and other information on the grounds that this was an open investigation. And pressure just built and built and built and built, and finally built to a point when a judge ruled that the video should be released.
I want to just warn our viewers what you are about to see is disturbing video of this police officer shooting and killing this 17-year-old teenager.
The officer in the shooting was named, Officer Jason Van Dyke, and immediately everybody went to our database to find out about Officer Van Dyke's history. And what people found when they went to the database is that Van Dyke had 20-odd complaints against him, 10 of which were for excessive force, and a number of those coupled with racial verbal abuse. That pattern that emerged from those 20 complaints surely warranted a supervisor, an investigator, looking to see what was going on with this officer. You know, I don't want anybody to imagine that we have a metric for saying X number of complaints, bad officer. That's really not the point of the data. The point of the data is you have the means to identify relatively early, before the worst thing happens, occasions to intervene. The police play an absolutely critical role in a democracy, and we vest them with extraordinary powers. The power to stop and detain people, the power to use force, the power under certain circumstances to use deadly force. These are extraordinary powers, and in a democracy, with power comes accountability.
Thanks for watching. For more on the Citizens Police Data Project, go to cpdp.co and use the interactive map to explore the data for yourself. And be sure to subscribe to FreeThink for more great videos.
I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.